today was, I had one more thing to cover in the previous slides, which was just
is that? Is that
238. Just an interesting point on, the government's responsibility as Hobbes sees it vis-a-vis the poor.
Okay.
And this is just, I point this out because it's really unusual for somebody in his day to even really think about this. Some of the medieval philosophers, the theologians, had some notion of, the monarch ought to bestow welfare upon the people. But for him to be talking about this at all with his much more modern view of government is interesting, because welfare wasn't on the radar screen, government-sponsored welfare, and it didn't become on the radar screen until the 19th century, really. Okay. So throughout the whole Enlightenment period, there was very little talk of systematic government, welfare, the idea that it's better for everybody if we take care of the poor, not through charity, which would be the alternative, but through government. So what he says...
and he basically says, I see it right here, just because of human nature, pretty much.
Yeah, right. There's certain things that we can't count on just the charity of people to provide for. And he actually says, because of chance, some people will just not make it. In other words, he's not using the old notion of because of their moral failings, they won't make it. But just some people just slip through the cracks. Not everybody, some people get an injury or they just have bad luck. He says on the left of 238, whereas many men by accident inevitable, that's just sort of like by the numbers, by the odds, become unable to maintain themselves by their labor, they ought not to be left to the charity of private persons, but be provided for as far forth as the necessities of nature required by the laws of the commonwealth. For as it is uncharitableness in any man to neglect the impotent, so it is in the sovereign of the commonwealth to expose them to the hazard of such uncertain charity. So, and then he goes on, they should be made to work. So basically he's talking about government-sponsored workhouses, and this became something in the 19th century.
It's like a form of socialism, kind of socialist.
A little bit, just slightly, yeah. So it's interesting, he's got this idea, the nascent idea of the welfare
He's definitely
state.
Considered a realist, isn't he? Though?
Yeah, and for the most part.
He kind of plays into both fields a little bit. It's a little interesting.
He does. His view would not prohibit strong control of the economy, actually. We've already seen that he talks about how property is not truly the individuals, but the sovereigns to control. So, and here he's saying he can use the coffers of the state to provide for people. And it's in the interest of everybody because it cuts down on crime, it helps the economy, the state gets some work out of it. So during the Industrial Revolution, this became a reality. With governments, it was draconian by today's standards, but governments opening up workhouses and basically saying, look, if you don't have anything else, we will put you to basically hard work and feed you and put you up until you can get back on your feet. And that was welfare for quite a while, Before that, it was, if anything, churches and private institutions with soup kitchens and other forms of charity, orphanages, right? But they were privately funded. With his view of human nature being rather cynical, you can see why he wouldn't want to rely on just charity, right? Even religion takes on a self-interested flavor with Hobbes. So.
No, that makes total sense why I assumed he wouldn't want anything to do with charity.
Yeah. Oh, I have to check this. Hold on.
That's okay.
All right. So, it's interesting. Now, for the most part, he's a fan of private property. He believes that when people are left alone to their private lives as much as possible to pursue profit, it's better for everybody. But
then he says ultimately it's sovereign,
Right. You can't let people think this is their right, right? And this is somewhere where he and Locke differ drastically. As you pointed out last time, this is, Locke says that property that you mix your labor with becomes a part of yourself in a way. And just as you would say, I have a right to my own self-preservation and my bodily freedom, I also have a right to the property that I've mixed my labor with. And then later on, actually, he talks about with the invention of money, you have a right to that property that you can buy as well. And if the sovereign comes and tries to take some of that in the form of taxes, or even worse, confiscation, without your permission, without some sort of mechanism like representation, right, for you to assent to the taxation, then he's violated your natural rights and you have a right to resist. Okay. So it's a very, very different view of property.
Okay.
And, you know, I mean, so very different implications. And I think you're right. Hobbes would actually, I don't think that he could imagine socialist or communist countries, but if he could see them, I don't know if he would really object. You know, if they work economically, that would be,
Was Thomas More before or after him?
Thomas More was around the same time, about the same time, just getting started.
Okay. I just didn't know if he would have read
maybe a
any
little
of
bit
his,
before.
If he would have read any of his Utopia at all.
He might have, yeah. Let's see. Thomas More, I think early 16th century, and Hobbes is more mid to late 16th century. So yeah, he probably did.
Yeah.
And maybe he got some ideas.
Yeah, he might have.
Right, because More was very visionary about this. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to do today was just go through this document, Hobbes versus the Ancients, and just deal with the highlights. What I wanted to do, since I have the time, is to have you take a step back and think about the larger implications of Hobbes's thought and modern political thought generally versus previous political thought.
Okay.
And this is something that students have a harder time doing. Even I've chaired, or not chaired, but sat on PhD committees over in history. And these history PhDs, one of the hardest things for them is to take that step back from the weeds of the text or the details of the period, which they're very good at, and look at the larger picture and discuss the implication of these major movements of history and major ideas in our case. And so I like to do that occasionally. So let me give you a copy of this. At the beginning of the semester, we did a little bit of this with Leo Strauss's What is Political Philosophy and the points that he made. And this document delves into the chapter on Hobbes in the Strauss-Copsey Reader, which makes some of these points of comparison too.
I remember seeing some of these.
Okay, good. So we'll just talk about the implications of these. The first one, you know, the ancients saw the philosophers saw human beings as political animals, social animals. Hobbes saw human beings as either asocial, meaning they really didn't pay attention in nature to other people. That's actually not. It's more likely that Hobbes saw human beings as antisocial. They're threats, right? And therefore, the social contract is radically conventional. It's a product of individual human beings for their self-interest, not because they naturally go together. Okay. So the implications for that, for the way that modern people in modern liberal society view their government, okay? One implication is that if we view human nature in this way, we can see it in Hobbes's way, right? As asocial or antisocial, and the social contract being so conventional, we can view human beings as very engineerable, moldable. What I mean by that is if we can see everything as a product of human agreement, then the door is opened as to what we shall agree to.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
So it's kind of set in a predetermined notion in a way of like how human nature needs to be.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a way of putting it?
Right. In other words, yeah, we can, if we know human nature is, it's fixed in this way, that it's self-interested it tends to be passionate, but it can be controlled by agreement. Then we can start thinking about what kind of agreement do we want, right? Well, it could be socialism, it could be communism, it could be that we want to use, and Hobbes gets into this later in this book, we want to use education to make people a certain way. We want to mold and shape them through religion or through some other ideological means, right? So this way of thinking does open the door to social engineering, to the idea of molding people through their environment, through the control of their environment. It also opens the door to what we call historicism, which is the idea that human beings are product of their time. That kind of goes along with it. If we see human beings as a product of the particular contracts they make,
in Intro to Political Thought.
To a certain extent, yeah, we did, right. So if they're products of a particular contract at a particular time, again, we can see that may change over time. The contract, the arrangements that we make may change. So we pull up the anchor, basically, from nature and say, we can do whatever we want, and that's not necessarily where Hobbes wanted us to go with this, but that is indeed what happened, okay? The anchor prior was either, the ancient view of the moral law or the medieval Christian view of God's law and God's plan. And now we have human decisions. And human decisions mean I can do what I want. And if we make a social contract, we can make it our way. Obviously, Hobbes thought monarchy was the best way, but he opens up this Pandora's box. It actually can lead in many different directions. Enlightenment can lead to socialism and communism. It could even lead to fascism. So you can see the very deep roots of the 20th century in Hobbes. Okay, second point. The ancients defined humanity as rational, but Hobbes defines humanity as passionate and prideful, and political order therefore must subdue our passions, right? And the chapter makes a point of saying, so therefore the task of reason is to devise a means of redirecting and intensifying the correct passion, which is fear of death, over the incorrect passion of glory. So reason becomes a way of getting what we should want instead of ruling. The passion of fear should rule. Okay, so we might ask ourselves, what is the implication of that what is the implication of Hobbes' way of looking at human nature for our view of government? Okay, what do we lose by looking at human nature in this way as not rational but passionate, reason being instrumental, something that gets us to a predetermined goal? One of the things that the ancients thought, especially Aristotle thought was important, was that politics should be about developing the person into the best citizen they can be, exercising their reason and speech to the greatest extent that they can. Hobbes doesn't think so, In fact, people should shut up, right? Citizenship is very limited in Hobbes' view, to obedience, to doing your duty. You are a citizen, but citizenship does not mean and should not mean participating and deliberating. Okay? So there's a big implication there. The best life then for Aristotle was the life of the citizen, fully involved in the city's decisions. And there is no one best life for Hobbes and for future modern liberal thinkers. The best life is determined by the individual.
Okay. So you're saying the ancients cared about the life of the citizens, Hobbes didn't, but he cared, but because it was just all about individuality, pretty much.
The individual, decides. It's a private pursuit, right?
Yeah.
So many individuals will decide that making money and having a certain level of prosperity is their private goal. And they will spend their lives doing that. And that's what Hobbes wants them to do, to to live good, solid, private lives, usually acquiring as much as they can, and leaving government alone. Some individuals, though, will decide religion is their goal, and that's okay for them too, to become a minister or, even a private person whose main purpose in life is piety. That's fine too, as long as it's a private pursuit and it aligns with the state religion, right? So there can be different goals for individuals, and this becomes a bigger phenomenon as we move along through Locke, Rousseau, in Mill, and future liberal thinkers. The individual privately decides what his greatest good is and the best life. But we don't have collective agreement because human beings aren't foremost rational. See, if they were, there would be hope that we could actually deliberate and agree as a community on what the best life is, and then we could create laws that support it. But if we're not rational first and foremost, then this is the best that we can do. And you can see this in our contemporary society. It's very individualistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
People decide and oftentimes change their mind about what their life is going to be about.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And this is fine because it's private activity, it's not threatening to the state, and as you pursue your private interest, which for the most part is going to be economic, then that's good for everybody. Okay? So that's another implication. Third point, the ancients viewed justice as a moral quality separable from human law. So that meant natural law teaching, as we've already discussed. That older view of natural law teaching is that the natural law, justice, is something higher and separate from any human notion. And you ought to be able to judge human laws in light of natural laws. Hobbes is a positivist, right? He views justice as inseparable from enforcement. You can't have law and justice if it's not enforced, and enforced very regularly and forcefully. So, the implications for this different view of the law, right? Well, if we view the law as in a positive sense, as in it's a law and it's just if the government has duly promulgated it, right? What implications are there for, say, our view of other countries' laws?
So how we view other countries'
Yeah,
laws?
other countries very different from
Well,
ours.
I mean, every culture's very different. I mean, if you look at it from a sociological perspective, I mean, we could see something that a law that they have is like completely absurd compared to what we have.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the implication could be just the shock of.
It's completely absurd,
yeah.
but can we really say
But we
it's
can't
wrong?
say we can't say it's wrong because in the perspective of their eyes, it's probably right.
Right.
So we have no right in.
We have no right.
In telling them that they're wrong. Yeah.
Exactly, right. We can say, that's crazy. It doesn't seem like anything we would do, and yet when it comes to criticizing, let's say by whatever means they have, they've duly promulgated their laws, right? And it's enforced. The government enforces those laws. If we don't believe in this higher transcendent natural law, we have no grounds to criticize. So this is the relativistic problem, right? If Saudi Arabia says that women can't drive cars and have to ask their husband, father, or brother before moving about, that's their law. We can't criticize. And modern people find this very problematic, because they really feel like they don't have a philosophical ground to protest, and yet they see some things as very inhumane. So it's a problem created by this notion that Hobbes exemplifies, that law is what human beings make it. In fact, it's part of the social contract. It's radically artificial, basically. Okay. So far, so good?
Yep.
Okay.
Good so far.
All right. And these are things to kind of contemplate, actually, to go back. I mean, the reason why I give you the sheets is because, every step of the way as you learn more political philosophy, you want to come back to this kind of thing and ask yourself, how does this person fit into this? And what are the implications of of his or her thoughts.
Okay.
All right, so the fourth point, the ancients sought to encourage statesmanship. That flows out of what's already been said, that the leader should know that natural justice. The best leader is the one who understands justice well and rules for the common good, not for his own self-interest, right? So the best regime is the rule of the wise, the republic, or in Aristotle's case, the polity, but it's ruled by those who are good citizens, right? Hobbes rejects the idea of statesmanship utterly because, first of all, he doesn't think that those types of leaders are very likely. You know, most of the time you don't find these wise, benevolent leaders. You find ordinary human beings, and
Exactly.
you have to find some way of making sure that their rule is
Well, I was
safe.
getting ready to say that, like, his idea of the whole one man's kingdom is another man's tyrant. I was going to say I was almost certain that would play into him rejecting that. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it's all subjective anyway. If we keep our eye on the ball, it should be about survival and about safety. So he expects the sovereign to act in his self-interest, and the best form of government is the one in which the self-interest of the sovereign basically coincides with the self-interest of the people. And this is why he advocates monarchy.
So basically, and the ancients just thought it should be rule of the wise, whereas Hobbes is just self-interest of the whole body, self-interest of the sovereign, right?
Self-interest of all,
Yeah.
right? And so the ancients had a way of criticizing existing governments, and this is what Hobbes doesn't like. You know, the fact that Plato or Aristotle could say, that's a bad government. Well, that's something he doesn't want people to think. He doesn't want to encourage people to make these evaluations. So obviously, I think this has taken, right? In modern society, modern liberal society anyway, we don't look at our leaders as moral leaders, right? In fact, that kind of scares us to think of them as moral leaders. We don't expect them to be heroic or to be role models or anything like that. Is there a loss there? I mean, we see what we gain, right? Because, well, for one thing, we gain what Hobbes thinks we should gain, more stability because of lower expectations. We probably also gain in not being disappointed, being more, seeing the government with clearer eyes. But is there anything we lose when we look at our leaders so realistically and don't expect anything more than self-interest out of them?
So when we look at them kind of without a sense of, I guess, of emotional attachment in a sense, is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, and admiration,
One thing I can only think of is you lose a sense of, I guess, personal feel towards the leader. Like, there's no likability. And it, like, I'm just kind of comparing it to our government.
So less loyalty.
Yeah, less loyalty in a sense, yeah.
Yeah, you definitely lose that. And with that sense of loyalty can come a sense of unity, that in more traditional regimes, lots of times the person becomes a symbol for the state. And if he or she is admirable, then people can coalesce around that, and that forms more of a sense of national purpose. Obviously, that has its dangers, right? That can be misused, that kind of power, that kind of admiration and loyalty can be misused. But we don't have a system which encourages unity in that way, and that is somewhat of a loss. Again, we are individuals. We see the leader as instrumental. Does that leader do something good for me or not, right? And if we could see that leader as benevolent, as wise, as sort of taking care, it would be a way that we could come together under that person, right? So some of the loss is unity. Some of the loss is, if we think that role models do people any good, and the ancients did think that, then we don't have, or at least that's not a source of role models for us, right? And in fact, if you ask people today, who is your hero or role model, if they can come up with one at all, it's usually somebody close to home.
Yeah.
Their mom, their dad, aunt, uncle, friend, boss, somebody like that.
Mhm.
So it's very, very personalistic, very egalitarian in a way.
Okay.
All right. Fifth point, ancients saw justice as the highest good, whereas Hobbes sees peace as the highest good. Obviously, peace is the highest good because peace brings survival. Okay. There are implications for this focus on peace and order and stability. One implication, which Tocqueville points out, is that human people don't see their government or their society as a source of glory, heroism, greatness. Okay, so instead they just want stability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because whenever you seek more than that, heroism, greatness, you're likely to create conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the aristocrats of old sort of looked at conflict as an opportunity to display, what they were made of. And Tocqueville reacts to this preeminence or this focus on peace as somewhat cowardly.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
He
interesting.
approves and disapproves of it at the same time. He says, this is the future, and there's a great good here to peace for ordinary people. Their lives are going to be more secure. They're going to be happier in a way. However, you lose opportunities for greatness that, again, unify people, that make them feel better than their ordinary lives can possibly make them feel. And of course, conflict creates an arena where the outstanding can truly shine. So he actually is one of the few modern thinkers that says war is not all bad.
We don't read any Tocqueville, do we?
Well, not in this class, no.
Do you read him in your 661?
In ideologies we did a little
you did?
bit.
Okay.
Yeah, but Tocqueville, no, not in 661. Probably modern political thought, which this isn't actually. We're going to have a new professor next fall.
Yeah.
He's going to teach it, and I wonder if he'll use any Tocqueville or where he'll start. And I'm going to start teaching more in different classes because he's coming, so.
However, he creates a syllabus for that. Can you have him send it to me?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah.
I might take that.
I will, yeah. And I love to teach a course on Tocqueville. Now I'll be able to do
Especially
specialty
since you've read your
courses.
book,
Yeah. In fact, I might propose that for next year. But yeah, Tocqueville's just, he's super interesting because he has one foot in the aristocratic past and one foot in the democratic future.
Mhm.
And he's rare in that he's a liberal, okay? There were people at his time who were...
So Tocqueville was a liberal?
Tocqueville was really a liberal.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, he sees the future. He generally approves of it.
Okay.
He is not one of these people that wants to return to the old ways. Not a reactionary. He's not a conservative. There were people at his time who were saying, not only is war good, but we need to destroy, these democratic reforms, and we need to move back to the
Isn't
old
the
ways.
idea of him saying the conflict is good, wouldn't that be more of a realist thought, though?
Well,
Is-
no, not I mean, he is somewhat of a realist, I
Mhm.
guess, in some ways, but it's more than that. It's sort of a romantic notion of warfare.
Oh, okay.
Hegel had a similar
Yeah.
point, that it brings out the best in people, that it creates opportunities for heroism, that it creates opportunities for
I guess
love
that's
of
true.
country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And, if you carry that too far, it moves into the area of the reactionary thinkers lent their intellectual firepower to, fascism.
Mhm.
Tocqueville doesn't want to go in that direction at all, but, he does see the overemphasis on peace as somewhat cowardly. And he searches around, he says, how can we see any heroism or honor in American democracy? Well, we can see it's to a certain extent in the military, but at his time the American military was very small and it didn't have much to do for quite a while. But he could see that there was a clash between the honor ethic of the American military and the civilian population. And so he keeps groping around, and he finds some honor and heroism actually in American economic activity, because it was still, people were still exploring the West. They were still risking their lives to go, stake out some territory, and some of the American entrepreneurs were willing to risk their fortunes.
Mm-hmm.
But this was a lower order of heroism and honor than you could possibly attain in the old system. So there's that. There's also some implication for democratic or liberal democratic diplomacy and foreign policy, and you see that in the way that we look at conflict generally. You see it right now with how we're dealing with Vladimir Putin or with ISIS, and we understand we need to do something about it, but darned if we don't want to. We definitely want to err on the side of caution.
Yeah.
We tend to do something when we absolutely have to. We certainly don't look at these as opportunities to display our might, right?
Yeah.
Even though we could. Right. So we think about what this will do to our economy, what this will do to our national security. We want to find a way to solve things peacefully whenever we can, even in the face, as we're seeing now, of absolute evil.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, ISIS is it is like Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
It's just as bad. It's a question of whether it's as much of a threat, more of a threat, less of a threat. And there may come a time when we just absolutely have to go full bore against this group. But you saw with World War II, we didn't do that until we were really kind of hard-pressed to do it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's both comforting and troubling. It's comforting that we don't have a government that plunges in.
I mean, you look at it with the war with Iraq. I mean, took a major incident 9/11 for us to be pushed fully over there, I guess.
Exactly.
Putting it,
Right. And even then, it took a certain leadership that, under other circumstances, if we had a different leader, that might not have happened. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, sixth point, the ancients encouraged magnanimity, the magnanimous man, somebody who understands his greatness and receives praise with generosity because he deserves it. Okay, and this would be part of that, the ability to look up to the heroic leader, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of reflect or mirror his qualities and use that person as a role model. Well, partly reflecting the Christian ethic of humility, even though Hobbes is a dubious Christian, he certainly absorbed that, and so did the rest of his society. They've rejected that old way, right? We learned this in DAS 300, right? Instead, humility and equality is emphasized. And the previously admirable qualities of self-assertion are replaced with humility and accommodating nature, forgiveness, and these qualities, right? They're basically Christian qualities.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And of course, the benefit, again, is that these lead to social peace, which is a big deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the drawback is, again, nobody stands out. There's a leveling, right? There's a leveling that occurs. Even in Hobbes's monarchy, it's democratic in a way. Everybody is equal under the sovereign. We get rid of the pretension of the aristocrats. They may still exist, but Hobbes wants to make it clear the only difference between him and me is money, which is something that, ironically, that Marx says in the Communist Manifesto. You may remember. He says that the veil falls from people's eyes, and they realize that the only difference between them and their so-called natural superiors is cash. So Hobbes says this way back then, and it would be a long time before people would totally absorb this, but it would happen, and it has happened.
Okay. But Hobbes sees no issue with nobody standing out,
Not enough of an
Not
issue,
really? Okay.
right? I mean, I think that he doesn't perhaps
he
understand.
sees it fine that that everybody just stays on their role and he's happy with it.
Yeah, I don't think he fully understands the implication of his own thought here.
Yeah.
He was living during a time when there still were plenty of aristocrats around, and he was actually being taken care
Was
of
he
by
just
them.
kind of, I guess he wouldn't necessarily be annoyed with that if he was being taken care of them. I find it funny then that he said that nobody should stand out if
It's
yeah.
Yeah, I think some of them understood the implications for themselves too. And, he's not in the business of attacking the aristocracy for the heck of it, but he does want them to pipe down as far as their influence in government. They've been a destructive influence.
That surprises me with this level in society. Yeah.
Well, he's probably thinking, I mean, if we don't want to psychoanalyze him too much, but here he is, a common man who's able to rise up through his own intellect, right? More than, Hobbes probably would look at it more that way than these people made me who I am, right? Oh, instead, these people recognized that I'm worth supporting. And, there are plenty of people in the world who don't happen to be born with a lot of money and status who are bright, like Hobbes, So he sees an equality there between himself and these other people, an intellectual equality, to say the least, or maybe even superiority that had to have maybe fed into, his views about the aristocrats. But at the same time, when dealing with them personally, he was nothing but humble to them himself. He relied on them. The Cavendish family supported him.
Yeah.
And the monarchy at times. Okay. All right. So, 7th point. Ancients saw religion generally as socially beneficial. And one of the big differences that people tend to just forget about between the ancient and even the medieval, and definitely the modern view, is the difference between polytheism and monotheism. Okay, so for the ancients, with polytheism, there was the possibility that many religious views could coexist without conflict. You've got your gods, I've got mine. Hey, we'll worship each other's gods. We'll hedge our bets.
That's interesting. I never thought about that.
It's easy to accept other people's gods.
Wow.
Because there's multiple gods.
Polytheism does create a whole different, wow.
It does.
That just blew my mind.
It's much easier to tolerate in a practical sense, and actually this often happened where you'd have your set of gods and another king rolls through your territory and establishes control, and you decide to worship those gods as well. The more gods, the better. In monotheism, it automatically...
Do you think Hobbes would have an issue with polytheism?
No,
Probably
actually,
not.
no.
Yeah.
One of the more weird things in his book is that occasionally you run into statements that sound like he would have no problem with polytheism.
Just because it can exist, there's no conflict with it probably.
Right.
He just has an issue with this monotheistic type, I bet. Yeah,
Monotheism creates problems, right? It creates the sword, basically, the sword of religion, because now my God can't be equal to your God. It's one or the other. In fact, your God doesn't exist, and I think you're entirely wrong. And this is what creates such potential for conflict. So it's for this reason that you have to strongly control religion in his view and keep it under the sovereign power. Okay. So there are many implications that come out of this for modern society, but definitely our wariness towards religion, our skepticism about it, our desire to kind of keep it either in private or under the control of the government or both, right? Our solution in this country is to keep it private. And we get uncomfortable when people even start talking about religion in mixed company. I remember last semester you got pretty uncomfortable during one of Sorensen's lectures, right?
I don't think it was Sorensen. I think it was, yeah, I did. It was Sorensen. It was the one on whenever we talked about the...
what about God?
Yeah, I just stayed out of it. That was getting ridiculous.
You kind of got back into it after a while.
I did, but I was just... I just tried to stay out of that entire debate. That was getting... Oh, God.
I think your reaction was similar to several other. Some people were willing to plunge in, and other people were, oh my God, we're not really going to talk about this.
I just know that causes so much conflict that I just don't like to talk about that unless it's in a civil debate and people were getting too heated about it. So I was like,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, it brings out a lot of emotions in
It
people,
does.
which is why this, the liberal solution is this is your private life, right? And now originally that meant, to somebody like Locke, that would have meant don't go out and force other people to believe as you or harangue them and tell them they're going to hell. But it has become, maybe we shouldn't talk about it, right? Because if we talk about it, we'll argue, and it's not something that maybe not worth arguing about, or we just don't want to argue, to that extent. And we also tend to believe argument gets us nowhere in matters of religion.
Well, that's exactly what it's funny, that's exactly what I was just getting ready to say. That's one reason why, because you're not going to change somebody's beliefs on religion, so I don't see the point in arguing with them about it,
It's true,
you
never will.
You never will.
Right, they have their
That
convictions.
is one belief you will never change.
The only way you could possibly change it is through example, right? By being a certain way. Some people may be attracted to your faith because they like you, but never by arguing with them. And this is something that Locke definitely knew and pointed out, that actually the more that you try to force people and argue with them, the more resistant they become. They may even actually agree with you on the surface, like in Hobbes' system. People will say, yes, sir, I'll go to that church. But in their heart, they resent it. And it's even less likely that they will become your type of Christian or a Christian at all. So we've thoroughly absorbed this, and to the point where our culture really promotes the idea that you don't talk about religion, even though, you might say that it is one of the most important aspects to many people's lives, right? But we keep it to ourselves and we try to get along. So this is a very strong implication. Another implication that flows out of that Tocqueville talks about, the downside of that is over time, people can lose their personal conviction. In other words, if you don't talk about it, or if you emphasize collegiality or getting along to that extent, it may become less important to you, and if it becomes less important to you, then it loses some of its power over regulating your behavior.
Okay.
Yeah, so, Tocqueville is all about religion's usefulness for regulating behavior, and many liberal thinkers are. And it's kind of a catch-22, because we don't want to talk about it because it creates conflict, but if we don't talk about it and openly display it, then it can't serve its purpose of helping people behave properly.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a problem there. And many modern philosophers try to grapple with that. Well, what do we do if a religion doesn't end up serving that purpose anymore? Is there something else? And actually, one of the things that I'm doing with honor is trying to answer that question. Is honor compatible with liberalism in a way that open religious conviction is not?
Okay.
Because if we don't have some means of helping people stay on the straight and narrow, there's not enough law enforcement in the world to regulate their economic and other behavior.
Exactly.
Okay. Final point, because we're about run out of time.
Okay.
Ancients saw the role of the intellectual as making leadership and government better, whereas Hobbes sees the role of the intellectual as making government more stable, secure, and lasting. This just kind of goes along with what we've said about leadership before. The goal is, as Martin Diamond put it, solid but low. And the intellectual, therefore, may not have a place in government, or if he does, it's an insecure place. So where do intellectuals tend to end up? Not in positions of power, but in think tanks, in focus groups, and they tend to serve a purpose to the extent that the leader wants them to and no more, right? They become secondary. And also we have a little bit of anti-intellectualism in a society such as ours, a suspicion that the intellectual wants to take on more authority than he really has a right to. And we have to keep them in our egalitarian frame, because they're out there with that somewhat of a threat to the stability of society.
If I'm reading this and hearing you right, so with the ancients, they just thought that the intellectual can
At least it
make
should.
everything, should make everything, and with Hobbes, it's just him.
Yes.
There's no intellectual, it's just him.
Just
right?
just the sovereign,
Gotcha.
just the
Okay.
sovereign.
Yeah.
And actually, the intellectuals don't know what they're talking about for the most part in Hobbes' view, except for himself. And the modern implication is the skepticism about the intellectual that you see coming out. It's good to get in higher education, but like, for instance, if you get a PhD, there will be people who will just automatically resent your existence. And it's because you threaten the egalitarian notion of society with the idea that you know more than somebody else. And it's something that you have to negotiate. I always tell my friends, when you introduce me to other people, please tell them that I work outside of the home.
That's funny.
And leave it to me to somehow break the ice. Because if they tell them, well, she's a professor at Kansas State, lots of times the whole, it gets canceled. No kidding.